Today we're going to talk about short story elements and an introduction to science fiction. So this should look rather familiar to you. These are the four basic elements of a short story. We have plot, character, setting, and theme. And we're just going to briefly review these to make sure that we're all on the same page. So this little plot diagram should look familiar to you. The plot is the sequence of events in a story. So it's like the blueprint of what happens, when it happens, and to whom it happens. Remember that plots are almost always built around conflicts or problems or struggles between opposing forces. Exposition is the proper term for the first part of plot. The exposition is the beginning of the story, and this is where we learn about who the characters are and their settings. This is also where the author generally supplies some background information and sets the tone of the story. Is it a scary story? Is it going to be a really lighthearted story? We learn all of this in the exposition. The second part of plot is, of course, the rising action. This is all of the things that happen between the beginning of the story, the exposition, and what comes next. So this is where the story becomes rather complicated. This is usually where the conflict or the problem is revealed, and this is also usually where the author tries to utilize some suspense. And then, of course, what comes next is your climax. This is the highest point of interest in the story. This is usually where there is a turning point. This is where the suspense reaches its peak. And this is where the reader wonders what will happen next. Will the conflict be resolved or not? Then we have the falling action. The events and complications begin to resolve themselves in the falling action. The reader knows what has happened next and if the conflict was resolved or not. And then finally, we have the resolution. This is the part of a plot that concludes the falling action by revealing or suggesting the outcome of the conflict. This is where we usually tie up the ending in a nice little bow and end our story. Next, we have setting. This is the particular time and place in which the events occur. Remember, there can be really specific settings like grandmother's dining room at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. There can be more general settings like New York City in the fall. Theme is the perception about life or human nature that the writer conveys to the reader. That's the real definition. What I like to say is the theme is the lesson that we learn. Okay, so think about theme as a lesson. An example is life is only as good as you make it, or good relationships take work. So the next thing we're going to talk about is science fiction and fantasy. First, we're going to talk about fantasy. Fantasy is something that you have probably heard of before. It is a work of fiction in which things are made very extravagant, and there's a disregard for the restraints or the limitations of reality. So kind of anything can happen in fantasy. The aim of fantasy is usually to make us happy, but it also can be used to make comments on serious matters of our reality. So an example of fantasy would be Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Lewis Carroll, who's the author, creates a world that isn't real in this amazing imaginary world. Now, what we're going to be talking about more specifically is science fiction, and science fiction is a type of fantasy. So science fiction presents the possibilities of what could happen in the future using known scientific data and theories, as well as using one's imagination. Most science fiction comments on our present day society, what's going on today, through the writer's fictional conception of a future society. So I bet you can already think of some stories that you are familiar with that could be considered science fiction. Now, this right here, this author is Ray Bradbury. And the reason that I wanted to mention him briefly is because we are going to be reading 3 of his short stories. A Sound of Thunder is the first one that we will read by Ray Bradbury. We're also going to be reading The Pedestrian and There Will Come Soft Rains. Now, if you look at these three images, we have the movie The Time Traveler's Wife, we have Back to the Future, and we have the TV show Heroes. Just looking at these three pictures, they all have something in common, and they've all been influenced by other pieces of literature. So, what is it that they have in common? Well, they have all been influenced by something called the butterfly effect, which we're going to be learning more about in the first short story we read, A Sound of Thunder. So the butterfly effect is a phrase that refers to the idea that a butterfly's wings might create tiny changes in the atmosphere that may ultimately alter the path of a tornado or delay, accelerate, or even prevent the occurrence of a tornado in another location. The flapping wings represent a small change in the initial condition of the system, which causes a chain of events leading to a larger scale alterations of events. Had the butterfly not flapped its wings, the trajectory of the system might have been vastly different. So it's this idea that one small thing that happens could change something that changes something else and changes something else. That's the butterfly effect. In other words, you can also think about it as the domino effect. As the world runs out of gas prices will rise. When this happens, prices for specialized items of import and export like coffee will eventually rise. Because of this, food prices will then rise. And because of that, the price of products that require oil to make them will also rise. Okay? So it's that idea that even if we can't see it right away, it causes something that causes something else that could infect our entire being. So we're going to be looking at this idea of the butterfly effect as we read our first short story in class. All right, that's all I have for today.